This conference on the Zika virus, researchers talked about how the disease affects pregnant women and babies. Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease talked about their effort to develop a vaccine. This is an hour 40 minutes.
We have a terrific group of global health leaders that will be here to discuss it. I'm going to just begin with a little context, and then I'll be introducing Dr. Tony Fauci, then our panel, which I will moderate, so that we'll...
This is Dr. Larry Gostin. He is the boss of Alexandra Phelan and Rebecca Katz at Georgetown University. He is also the individual who wrote much of the Emergency Preparedness Act for diseases, germs, bioterrorism, etc. During the summer of 2001, most of which was available before the planes hit the towers on September 11th, 2001, and was enacted afterwards. Again, this is Dr. Larry Gostin, who is going to be chairing this board, which took place on August 31st, 2016, regarding the Zika virus, which is also going to be hosting, also starring, if you will, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Larry Gostin, mostly unknown person, very important person to know. Your freedoms have, for the most part, if you're an American, been impacted by this individual.
We'll have a conversation among each other. Finally, we'll have a break about halfway through, and then during the second part of the session, there will be an active question and answer period. I know there are some very, very esteemed people in the audience, and so I do invite you to join the conversation. We come at this discussion at a very important moment for global health security. There have been, we had, only a year or two ago, a major Ebola epidemic, and including cases here in the United States, that spawned no less than 4 major global commissions about our lack of preparedness, including the lack of preparedness in the United States. And as we speak today, the World Health Organization's Director General, Margaret Chan, has assembled an emergency committee under the international health regulations to talk about a potential global health emergency, which is the yellow fever epidemic that's began in Angola and is engulfing Africa. And by the time we leave this meeting, we should know what the emergency committee's recommendations are, because there's a expected vaccine shortage for yellow fever, and we're trying to apportion those resources. So what I want to do is just put this Zika conversation in context. In the Latin American Caribbean region, there are 45 countries that have reported local Zika mosquito transmission. There has been increasingly worrying data coming out of particularly problems with neurological disabilities among infants, and particularly microcephaly. At the moment, there are 2 areas in the United States, both in Miami-Dade County, that are experiencing local mosquito transmission. There have been approximately 30 locally transmitted cases confirmed to date. And nationally, there are a couple of dozen cases of sexual transmission and thousands of cases of travel-associated Zika infection. And as we're going to be discussing today, we're uncertain what we're seeing, whether this is a hidden epidemic or whether or not there are other cases that we're not yet seeing, and we don't know what the future will hold in the United States and beyond. There also we'll be discussing not only the public health concerns, but also the moral concerns, because throughout the region, including in the United States, there's reason to believe that Zika affects the poorest communities. It affects women and their babies. And because it involves such controversial issues as contraception and abortion and health care for the poor, it raises the stakes in terms of our political understanding. So we're going to look at questions of health with justice. Just yesterday, Tom Frieden, the head of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, said that the funds that President Obama had allocated were virtually exhausted in the fight against Zika, particularly in the Miami area. Of the $222 million allocated so far, $194 million have been used, and he characterized that as the cupboard being bare. And we're going to hear from the great leader in the United States, Tony Fauci, and globally about what those funding implications might be, not only for Zika vaccines and diagnostics and treatments, but also other NIH priorities and the biological research agenda. Meanwhile, there's been congressional dysfunction. It's been about 6 months, a half a year ago, that President Obama in February asked Congress for a $1.9 billion Zika allocation, much like Congress passed that allocation for Ebola. But as of now, Congress went into summer recess without passing it. It's been a political football. Questions we're going to be raising are, should we play politics with the public's health and safety here in the United States? Mitch McConnell just said that he hopes to bring a bill up next Tuesday in Congress. But again, there are problems with the Democrats and the Republicans' conception of what we should be doing. So we'll talk about that, the public health implications, mosquito control, the progress there, research and development, health care for pregnant women and the poor, and generally, is the United States and is the World Health Organization prepared? I couldn't be more pleased to welcome our panel. Our featured speaker is a very, very dear friend, Tony Fauci, who has been for many, many years the thinker, conscience of infectious disease in America. And I can think of no greater tribute to somebody to say that he's really built the research and development agenda, and he has served as the voice and the conscience for infectious diseases and been as a steadying hand for continual outbreaks. Tony's told me that he never gets a summer off. It's not because epidemics start in the summer, but they start before and they linger on. And that's where we are with the Zika outbreaks. And then once Tony's finished making his presentation, I'll invite two wonderful friends and global health leaders to join me along with Tony in a discussion among ourselves. The first one I'll introduce is Steve Morrison at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is, I'm continually amazed at the astuteness of his thinking and his advocacy. I had the privilege of serving with him on global health commissions in the wake of Ebola, and no greater thinker about national security, political reasons for action and inaction, and global health security. And Dan Lucy will then be part of this panel. He's a senior scholar at the O'Neill Institute. I like to call Dan the microbe hunter because wherever there's a problem in the world, he's there. He's there to treat patients. He's there to advocate for reform. He's a thorn in the side of Margaret Chan at the WHO, as he should be. And he's literally just returned from Africa, where he's been working on yellow fever. So welcome, Tony, Steve, and Dan. And now I'll turn it over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Larry. It's really a pleasure to be back here again at the O'Neill Institute, and particularly to join my colleague and dear friends, Steve Morrison, Dan Lucy, and Larry, in discussing this really important problem that is really described on the first slide right here, a pandemic in process. This is not a retrospective analysis of what went on, but really a description of what's evolving more and more, literally every week, not only in the Americas, but as we see now from what's in the news in Singapore. They're starting to have a situation in Singapore which is really quite worrying, and I'm sure we'll get into that in the discussion period. But what I'm going to do is set the stage, as Larry said, for a discussion on Zika. I show first this paper that I recently published. It was in January, about a month and a half after it became clear to me and my colleagues at NIH that we needed to have an accelerated effort. I chose the title, Zika virus in the Americas, yet another arbovirus threat, because I wanted to put it into context that this is not just a one-off issue that we're facing. If you look over the last several years of the arboviruses that were really not an issue in the Americas that all of a sudden became an issue. West Nile in 1999, chikungunya in 2013, dengue back and forth and now accelerating over the last several years, and now most recently Zika. And so again, this is something that we're facing, and when I get to the end of the discussion, I'll tell you it's not the end, because we're going to see it again, I assure you of that. And the reason I say that is that about a year and a half ago, at the end of a talk that I gave to a large audience about Ebola and how the Ebola epidemic was ending, people were saying, well, we got through that, that's wonderful. And I says, it isn't over, it's something going to happen again soon. Unfortunately, I didn't realize it was going to happen about a month later with Zika, but it actually did. So I'm going to divide my discussion into 4 areas that I'll briefly touch upon to set the stage. First, a Zika background. Many people right now are very familiar because of the public attention that has been put to Zika. I show you this not to hit you with microbiological names, but to point out one thing. This is an RNA virus that is of the family Flaviviridae and the genus Flavivirus. Why is that important? It's important because these are the viruses that we have a lot of experience with. The flaviviruses also include dengue, yellow fever, Japanese encephalitis, and West Nile virus. It's bad news that we have a new one. It's good news that not only we have experience with flaviviruses, and I've had investigators working for decades on flaviviruses, but because we have made successful vaccines against flaviviruses. And I'll get back to that in a minute, why I have a fair amount of confidence that we will have a vaccine for Zika. When is really the issue. The other thing, it's transmitted by a mosquito that is copious in the Americas. That's critical. This didn't happen by accident. The setting was staged. The modes of transmission you're all familiar with, predominantly mosquito bites, but you've heard Tom Frieden and I over the last several months saying the more we learn about Zika, the more complicated and in some respects the more disturbing it gets, because not only is it transmitted by mosquitoes, which flaviviruses are transmitted by mosquitoes, but then we found out that there was intrauterine and perinatal transmission, which is the thing that sets Zika apart from all other related viruses. And of course, we'll get to that in a moment. Then we found out it's sexually transmitted, first from a man to a woman, and then we found out also from a woman to a man. And then we found out it was blood transfusion. I put other because we're still waiting to find out any other additional surprises, I hope not, that we'll see with this. The history of this is a textbook epidemiological case study. It really is. People are going to be studying this in public health schools for decades to come. It was first recognized, and people confuse recognize with occurring in the sense of just evolving. This virus has probably been around forever. It was first recognized in 1947 in the Zika forest of Uganda, hence the word Zika virus. The The first cases in humans were not recognized till 1952, and then it kind of went under the radar screen. And by under the radar screen, I mean we didn't really know exactly what the impact was, because if there were outbreaks, they were unnoticed in Africa and Southeast Asia. And when you don't have an outbreak, you don't really appreciate the extent of what a virus can do. But then as the years went by, in 2007, there was a modest outbreak in the Yap Islands, and then in 2013 in French Polynesia. That was kind of warming up to what might happen, and it worked its way nicely, as it were, not really nicely, but unfortunately for us, across the Pacific until it landed into what I call the perfect storm. And what is the perfect storm? The perfect storm is a very populous country that has economic and other conditions that make it conducive to have spread of mosquito-borne viruses, multitude of mosquitoes that are the right mosquitoes in a country that has a healthcare system that's good enough to notice what's going on. And that's really critical, because it was the fact that although there are pockets of poverty in Brazil, they have a pretty good healthcare system that can pick up things like microcephaly and other things. So what about Zika infection? It can be confusing to people because I call it dichotomous. What do I mean by that? That putting pregnant women aside, it's a fundamentally relatively benign and somewhat inconsequential disease. It infects people, and 80% don't know they're infected. 20% have symptoms that are usually mild: aches, pains, rash, fever, conjunctivitis. It tends to clear in 7 to 10 days, and then you're done. Except, and we'll get to the excepts in a moment. The current outbreak in the Caribbean and in Latin America have really galvanized the attention not only of us in the Americas, but for people throughout the world. If you look at, there are multiple maps that tell you things about Zika, but I like this map because what it tells you is that if you look at the areas that are environmentally suitable for Zika virus transmission, right climate, right mosquitoes, all the right things, this is the area in dark. So there are about 300 million people in the Americas who live in an area that's environmentally suited for Zika transmission. And within that group, there's 5.4 million births per year. And obviously, as we'll get to in a moment, the issue with microcephaly when women are infected during pregnancy is an overwhelming, important, compelling issue with Zika. And this is what I meant when the people in Brazil first started noticing a dramatic increase in microcephaly over and above the baseline. Now, you've heard people argue, well, they weren't really looking for microcephaly. So yes, it probably is a bit of an overcall, but there is no doubt there is a major, major increase in microcephaly associated with Zika, and we're seeing that in a number of other countries. What is microcephaly? Microcephaly is a congenital abnormality characterized by either underdevelopment of or direct destruction of the brain. Why do babies have small heads who get infected? It's really a fundamental anatomic explanation. As the brain develops during in utero development of a fetus, the brain pushes up the skull. So the contour of your skull is because the brain during development pushed it up. And when normally develops, it's a nice smooth contour. If you have developmental impediment of the brain, what happens? It doesn't push it up and the head looks flat or small. There's another thing called fetal brain disruption syndrome where the brain does develop well, but then a person gets infected during pregnancy, maybe later on in the second trimester, and what happens is that the brain caves in. And that's when you see pictures of children, very tragic looking, that have folds of skin as if they had a normal sized head and then it shrunk again. And there's a recent paper in radiology that shows some pictures that are really quite disturbing. We know now in one study, but we still have a lot more to learn, that in a study in Brazil, that if a woman gets infected during the first trimester of pregnancy, there's anywhere from a 1 to a 13% chance that the baby will have microcephaly. But microcephaly is the tip of the iceberg. What it is a rather gross manifestation of a congenital abnormality. But we know from other diseases like congenital rubella syndrome, that a baby could actually be born looking morphologically normal and have serious abnormalities of hearing, of sight, of intellectual capacity. In fact, there was a paper that came out 3 days ago that just showed the issue of visual and hearing abnormalities. There are also other abnormalities called arthrogryposis, which is a contraction and curling up of the limbs of individuals. We don't know what that's from, but it is likely from abnormal signaling of neurons, because this is all a brain issue. There's not any issue other than nervous tissues as the target. Now, one of the things that has just recently came about, and everyone was surprised about it, and I got a lot of calls from the press about it, that babies who were born with congenital infection had continual viremia for 67 days after birth. There's nothing new about that. When babies get infected in utero with viruses, and we have decades of experience with rubella, if you get infected in utero, because the immune system of the baby is not fully developed, the baby interprets the virus as self, so it doesn't make a response against it. And when the baby's born, you could have prolonged viremia for months, if not years. So this is not a surprise. Guillain-Barre is associated with a number of viruses, influenza, some bacteria like Campylobacter. To see an increase in Guillain-Barre is not surprising. It's something you would almost expect. What about Zika in the United States? Now, the United States, as you know, also includes Puerto Rico. And I learned a very good lesson on that. I was briefing President Obama in the Situation Room, and I was talking about the United States and Puerto Rico, and he said, "Time out, Tony. Puerto Rico is part of the United States." Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. President. The reason is they're American citizens. They're having a terrible time right now. They are in the middle of an outbreak that is going to be real. It already is bad, and it's going to be a really serious situation, because what happened with them with chikungunya in 2014 is that 25% of the population got infected. Now, if you look at the potential importation, so here's the crux of the problem. If you look, there are about 200 plus million journeys back and forth from the United States to areas with local transmission of Zika. 34 million by air, a lot by land and by sea. Which means, and this is something that I think people are starting to appreciate now, the difference between a travel-related case and a local transmitted case. In the United States, there are at least 2,500. There's probably closer to 10,000, because 2,500 recognized cases of travel-related, namely someone who's infected elsewhere and either comes back to the United States or travels to the United States. So if there are those many people in areas where there are the mosquitoes that can transmit it, it is not surprising that you then ultimately, as we absolutely predicted, would have local transmission. Among the people who are infected in the United States, there's over 500, close to 600 pregnancies. And in the territories, particularly Puerto Rico, there's over 800. So we are going to start seeing, as we already are seeing, cases of congenital abnormality among those pregnant women that are already here in the United States. Now, you heard Larry mention what is going on in Florida is, again, not unexpected. When you get local transmission, and we know this from dengue and from chikungunya, most of the time they're one-off. They're what are called singleton cases. A mosquito bites someone who's a travel-related case, bites someone who's never left the continental United States, they get infected and it's a dead end there. But occasionally there are cases that cluster and that are related to one another. We've seen that in two defined locations. One in Wynwood, which is a neighborhood north of Miami, and the other is the South Beach section of Miami Beach. So right now there are a total of 46 locally transmitted cases in Florida, several other sexually transmitted cases. So I want to stay within my time frame, so let me just close and spend a few minutes on looking at the role of research and development. Like you might expect, the response to Zika from HHS and other agencies was very similar to the response that we had to Ebola, which is a combination of the CDC doing their public health things that they do so well. With Zika, it's infection control and other public health issues. For the NIH, is fundamental, basic, and clinical research to understand the disease, one, and two, to develop countermeasures in the form of diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. And in fact, if you look at that, take a look at what just came out 2 days ago, was the identification of some molecules purely by high throughput screening that might have some activity against Zika. Now, be careful, because an in vitro activity against a virus doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in vivo. But I just show you this because it came out 2 days ago. Now, we're doing what's called a Zika in infancy and pregnancy study in South America and Puerto Rico, looking at 10,000 pregnant women, not necessarily Zika-infected pregnant women, but following pregnant women prospectively to determine what's the incidence of Zika and what's the incidence of malformations and congenital abnormalities in the babies. And then following the babies at birth, 3 months, 6 months, and a year. Also, vaccine, and this is a combination of basic research with animal models showing that you can actually protect monkeys against challenge when you vaccinate them with a variety of candidates, all of which are in the queue that we now have lined up for testing. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that I was reasonably confident, but I always say that with a caveat because one can be fooled. The reason I believe we will have an effective vaccine against Zika is that the body makes a pretty good natural immune response against Zika. And whenever you have a microbe in which the body already tells you that it's capable of making a good immune response, the chances are, if you try hard enough, you're going to get a good vaccine. We can't necessarily say that yet with HIV, because the body doesn't make a very good response against HIV. But these animal studies indicate that I think we're going in the right direction. Now, this is a complicated slide. I generally really don't like complicated slides, but I show it to you just to remind me to tell you. We have about 5 or 6 candidates that are lined up for testing with a vaccine. The first one that goes into testing isn't necessarily going to turn out to be the best one. People need to understand that. And that's the reason why you have a number of candidates. So let me just pick out one as the prototype and tell you where we are with it, with the assumption that other candidates are anywhere from 3 months to a year behind that. But the one that's temporally ahead is one that was developed at the Vaccine Research Center. It's a DNA vaccine. We started phase 1 trials in humans on August the 2nd. We'll be testing 80 people. It will take probably till November or December of 2016 to show that A, it's safe, and B, that it induces a response that you would predict would be protective. If we're successful in doing that, which I think we will be, and we'll get into the discussion later, if we're given the resources, we will move forward to a phase 2 trial, which will determine if it works. As opposed to having 80 people in the trial, the phase 2 trial will have anywhere between 2,400 and 5,000 people. It will be in about 20 to 25 sites in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. So that's where we are. And then if you take the second one down, the third one down, they're like a month, 7 months behind it. But sooner or later, we're going to get there. Now, we began, as I mentioned, the testing right here in Bethesda of the phase 1 trial. It's going to be in Bethesda at the NIH, at the University of Maryland, at Baltimore, and at Emory in Atlanta. So I want to close with this slide to remind you of what I said on the second slide, where I said yet again another arbovirus infection, is that we're dealing with an emerging infectious disease. This is something that I refer to often as a perpetual challenge. And I don't mean that to be hyperbolic, because it really is. There have always been, there are now, and there will always be new emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. And I think it's becoming apparent to all of us that when we need to respond, we need to have something that's already in place. And you've heard many of us talk about the idea of an emergency public health fund so that we don't have to go through the appropriations process, which is a good process, but it takes months and months and months. So I'll end with that, and I'd be happy to join the panel and discuss this further. Thank you.
thank you very much, Tony. That was superb as always. And why don't I begin with you and then widen it to some of the other political and ethical issues. I think there are many people in the public. I mean, it's kind of a dual public reaction. On the one hand, as I'm going to be talking about later among the panel, is that there's broad spread apathy among the population. There's something like 77% of a poll thought that there was nothing that significant to worry about. It was in marked difference to the public and political reaction to Ebola. But on the other, I think the public is wondering, is this a hidden epidemic? What aren't we seeing? We know about the confirmed cases in Miami-Dade, Florida. We know about some of the sexually transmitted cases. But in your sense, is this a hidden epidemic? Are there things we're not seeing? Are there things that we could do in terms of either epidemiology or diagnostic tests to enable us to have a better understanding of actual transmissions in the United States?
Well, if you say hidden epidemic and that we're going to find something totally transforming that we didn't know about it, I don't think that's the case. I think as we get more and more experience, it's clear that when you have larger numbers of cases, you will see things that are rare events. And there will be rare events, like a person died of meningoencephalitis. It's a benign disease, but every once in a while you're going to have somebody who gets really sick and ultimately dies. I don't think that this is hidden in the sense of a lot more people getting infected that we don't know about, even though you have to be careful of that because 80% of the people are without symptoms. But to your point about apathy, it's very interesting because you compared Ebola. There's something about the lack of connecting the dots when you have to convince the public that something is really serious if it essentially is a mild, somewhat trivial infection in everybody except pregnant women. So if you're not thinking in terms of you are a woman who's of childbearing age, you are a woman who's had a baby and understands how anxious you get during pregnancy, or if you are, a husband who has children and you understand the risks in pregnancy, people tend to not get upset about it because it's like it's somebody else's problem. And whenever you get a situation where people start to think it's somebody else's problem, then you get apathy. I don't think there's apathy among pregnant women because I talk to a lot of women who are thinking of getting pregnant and they're really very concerned about it. So it's an unusual situation. With Ebola, even though the risk of there being Ebola, I can say this now, I wanted to say it on TV so many times, even though the risk of having a major outbreak of Ebola in the United States is 0. Still, everybody was concerned about Ebola because they felt that they were vulnerable to Ebola. People don't feel that way with Zika, and that's why I think we have that dichotomy.
No, they don't. And yet, with pregnant women, I mean, this is, in a way, Zika is historic, and not only for the science that you've talked about, but it's one of the first, if not the first time that the CDC's issued a travel advisory for pregnant women not to travel to a place in the mainland United States. So that's something. Let me finish this round of questioning with research and development priorities. I am going to talk a little bit later on with the panel and Steve about the political situation. But what can you tell us or give us a sense about what your concerns are about not only research and development funding for Zika vaccines, diagnostics, treatments, and the like, but also for the wider NIH pipeline. If Zika continues in the United States and we don't see significant congressional funding.
Yeah, it is almost an inexplicable situation that has arisen about how we're not getting funded for something that's a public health emergency, and which instead of a clean bill to worry about it and let all the politics worry about things later, It just is very, very disturbing. The situation, as you know, maybe people in the audience have followed it carefully, but and I'll describe it, and it'll take half a minute, but it really is emblematic of what the issue that you're asking is, Larry. So when we first realized we had a problem, I got my staff together. I remember it very clearly in our conference room in December, and I said, all hands on deck. This is going to be a bad problem. We got to get people starting working on Zika-related things. We didn't have any designated Zika money. So what I did is I borrowed from myself. And borrowed from myself means I took money that I would then be spending in the summer, because now it's winter, it's December. I have money from malaria, money from tuberculosis, and I started spending it on Zika with the hope, and I thought assumption, that I would get that money back when we get Zika money. We didn't get any Zika money. Then we got to the point where I couldn't borrow any more for myself, so Secretary Burwell allowed us to spend some of the Ebola money to do things like get ready for the vaccine trial. Then I needed to prepare the sites for the phase 2 trial in January, but I already used all the Ebola money for the phase 1 trial. So then the secretary had to make a decision she really did not want to make, was to then use her transfer authority and say, now I'm going to take money from other NIH institutes, from cancer, from heart disease, from diabetes, so that we can do the phase 2, prepare the sites for the phase 2 trial. So she's giving me $34 million, $33 million of which is for vaccine to prepare the sites. Now here's the hooker related to what you say. Come the end of September, as Tom has said with the CDC, the cupboard is bare, come the end of September, as we go into the new fiscal year, if we don't get additional money to conduct the phase 2 trial, and remember, you talk about ethics, we have an ethical responsibility that you not start an experimental trial unless you are certain you can finish it. You taught me that years ago, okay? So therefore, we are not going to be able to start a phase 2 trial unless we absolutely know we can finish the trial, which means come October 1st, if the Congress doesn't give money to us, the secretary will again be faced with the very difficult decision, does she yet again take money from other things? It becomes a very difficult problem.
It is, and it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. We've got the cancer moonshot with Vice President Biden. We have so many priorities. So I want to turn to you now, Steve, because you're among the most astute observers of our political culture. We have a public health emergency. It's been declared. It was declared at the global level by WHO under the international health regulations and in the United States itself. What explains the bipartisan gridlock over what should be the primary responsibility of any governmental official, which is to protect the health and safety of the American population?
Well, first I want to say, because we do not have dedicated contingency funds for emergency response, it opens the way for politics to rule, for politics to dominate in the short term. And we're in a period in our history where we're in a particularly ugly and rancorous political cycle that's very anti-establishment, very anti-science. It's deeply skeptical. And in Congress, what we've seen is a pattern across multiple legislative challenges where there's been a failure to act, where there's been a meltdown internally within Congress itself, where basic common sense and decency has disappeared. And how else would you wind up with both parties agreeing 7 weeks ago to basically just score points on an emergency measure for a pressing and urgent humanitarian crisis on our soil, in order to, both parties agree to go away and simply score points rather than find a solution. So I think we are in a difficult period. We are pushed to the brink that Tony has described. I think also the steps that the administration has taken in good faith to scramble on an ad hoc basis and to find the resources to get a response going has the paradoxical effect of weakening the resolve of those in Congress to really act. I mean, how do you shame that institution into acting when under these circumstances, when you're beginning to do things that take the pressure off? That's another factor here. So I think we face a profound problem. I think we face a problem unlike what we've seen in other moments in time, and it's going to require some special solution, I think. And this fall is, Congress comes back next week. They're in session for only 3 weeks. There is a continuing resolution that's there. But will there be enough of an ethical sense within the leadership of Congress to not apply a rider, to not apply conditions that are divisive? Will there be a sense of common purpose that rises above this? We don't know.
And in terms of conditions, I mean, you were saying to me at lunch, Steve, about the kind of overlay in this outbreak, the overlay of political contentiousness, of contraception, abortion, Planned Parenthood, Medicaid funding for poor women and their children. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, when you talked earlier about apathy or indifference or an inability to get people to see what is in front of us, I think there are multiple factors that come into play. One, take Puerto Rico, which is the most dangerous and rapidly unfolding situation. Most Americans do not see Puerto Rico as part of America in reality. And Tony mentioned it in his own conversation with the president. I think all of us, in some way or another, face that problem. And so you have a country that is in a fiscal and political crisis. Its own leadership is having great trouble rising up to confront this. There are deep strains between the territorial leadership and the U.S. federal government. How do you unlock that? How do you unlock that political problem is a major challenge. How do we get people to focus on the centrality of vaccines? I mean, that is another issue that has to be put front and center. It's the only solution really that matters at this point. There's a certain resignation and skepticism about this because we haven't seen the full impacts yet. And on the surface, it looks like an innocuous kind of outbreak. And we don't have a whole lot to offer people, right? We don't have a vaccine. We don't have therapies. We have tests, but not widely distributed rapid tests. And controlling mosquitoes, as we've seen, can be quite difficult. So I think that breeds a certain skepticism or resignation that needs to be countered very systematically by the messaging coming from our own leadership.
Pivoting from that, I mean, you've talked a lot in your work, Steve, about national security and global health security for other diseases. And we saw during Ebola something quite remarkable in the United States. President Obama sent the military in. I remember I was asked on PBS NewsHour, what do you think of that? And I said I was very proud of America, which my sons loved. And we led a Security Council resolution. We've done similar things for AIDS. Do you see Zika at all as having any kind of economic or human or other kind of security threat? I think Tony's obviously right in terms of it's not going to be very widespread here in the United States. But talk a little bit about our approach in the United States and our preparedness, but also talk also about WHO and PAHO and the global response. So, for example, in WHO's strategic plan, it's only asked for $122 million US, which seems to be a gross underestimate of what you would need in the Latin America, well, all over. We've talked even about Singapore. So tell us a little bit about that and how Ebola differs or has some lessons from Zika has different or has some lessons from Ebola?
Well, Ebola was, the events in Atlanta and in Dallas in particular, they were dramatic, horrific, terribly frightening and alien, and they set off a media storm and set off a level of hysteria. Zika's different. This is vulnerable women struggling and deliberating, mostly in private and in conversations with physicians and with their family members. They're not motivated and to be out. They're not a public movement. They're not a big voice. And the delayed impacts, we haven't gotten to that point yet where we see the full material reality of this occurring. Now, the fact that there was the declaration in February by WHO of Zika as a global emergency, there was the recent declaration of Puerto Rico as an emergency. Do those really change the climate? Do they really move people, or do they prove to us yet again that those measures alone are not sufficient measures? We have to make the case, it seems to me, and this is to echo what Tony opened with, we have to make the case that it does not work in U.S. national interest or in global interest to be treating these emerging threats, these new pathogens, as in one-off, ad hoc, episodic approaches. We have to have a strategy that is looking at this as a new normal and a recurrent set of threats. And we need to gear ourselves up both in the leadership that we have within the White House and with our major institutions, and with the funding there accessible and ready and available, and not to be stuck in political fights with Congress.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, Steve, mostly in terms of what the U.S. role is in influencing, leading a global health security problem, and particularly its role with the United States, with the World Health Organization and the like. But I want to turn to you now, Dan. You have been following not just Zika, but you were in West Africa for Ebola. You've been in Africa for yellow fever. And you're a physician. So talk a little bit about the effects on poor pregnant women and their babies. What are the fears that they have? Are these fears justified fears? What should the political and international community do to actually, come to grips with this? Because I think many of us, I've just spent time in Latin America, and I've looked in the eyes of very poor young pregnant women who are really terrified. So, speaking as a physician's conscience, what are you thinking of that?
Well, first of all, I think it doesn't take being a physician to appreciate and to have empathy for what is going through the minds and the hearts of women who are pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant, and in their spouses and their partners and their family members and their loved ones, when there might be a risk or there is a known risk, which is the case for many, many countries now in the Americas, but also just starting to be documented in West Africa of Zika virus infection. And anyone who has a parent, anyone who is a parent can understand that. And I agree with Tony that I think it's that microcephaly is the tip of the iceberg, I believe is the image that we often use. And more data is coming out every few weeks to emphasize that. So the head size of the baby may not be so small that it meets the official measurement criteria for saying it's microcephaly, but there still can be brain damage, significant brain damage, general or localized to vision, to hearing, perhaps to cognition. And we won't know for sure how extensive that damage is until years to come. And that's only if we do appropriate studies, epidemiological and virological and immunological studies. So this is an epidemic that is in progress. It's going to be unfolding. In my opinion, it's going to get much worse in the months and even the years ahead in certain countries and certain parts of the world. So again, if I could just go forward to one message, I really want to emphasize that we know each other, and in fact, we all know each other, you know me, and I'm very concerned about where the virus is going next. And so when you look back to last October, the Zika virus is first documented in Colombia after Brazil, but also it was first documented in Cape Verde, which is an island nation off the coast of West Africa, not that far from Guinea-Bissau, from Guinea, from Sierra Leone, and from Liberia. And in my opinion, not enough attention was paid to the Zika outbreak in Cape Verde for that country itself, but also for what it meant. Where's the virus going next? It's always, in my opinion, so important not only to ask the question, asking is important, but more important is answering the questions as best as you can in any given time and space. So where's the virus going next? And in a sense, I think you can look back. The slide that Tony showed early on said it would be studied for decades in public health schools, and it will be, in terms of the transmission of the virus from 1947 in Entebbe when we first found it in the Zika forest, but it's probably been around for a long time before that. Onward across parts of Africa and Asia, and then what I call island hopping. So it was in Yap and the Micronesian islands, and then multiple other islands in Micronesia, then to French Polynesia, Tahiti and others in 2013. And that's when it was first, although in retrospect, found to be associated with congenital neurological damage, including microcephaly. But that didn't become apparent that it was going on in 2013-14 in French Polynesia until the Brazilians very astutely, because they have the public health infrastructure in Brazil and very distinguished and accomplished researchers and clinicians in Brazil to make the link with microcephaly and other types of brain damage. So island hopping. So then when you see it in the Caribbean islands, and then you see it in Cape Verde, an island off the coast of the mainland, very close to where obviously Ebola occurred in West Africa. So for me, I wrote a paper on March 17th that came out in Health Security. The title was something like, will epidemics of Zika and microcephaly follow those of Ebola in West Africa? And of course, in the paper I mentioned those three countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, but also one other one, and only one other one. And that was Guinea-Bissau. Why? Because it's also a former Portuguese colony, because there's plane flights frequently between the two countries, as well as from Brazil. And so on July 1st this year, it was reported the first cases of Zika in Guinea-Bissau. So it's no longer just on an island, it's in the mainland. And as of last Friday's WHO update on Zika, which they put out every week, just like they do on yellow fever towards the end of the week, they reported that there's 4 reported cases of Zika since July in Guinea-Bissau, and the genetic sequencing, for reasons that escape me, still hasn't been finalized since July 1st, so 62 days, as to whether it's the so-called African strain or the Asian Brazilian strain. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was the Brazilian Asian strain, because that's what's in Cape Verde. And also, since April, there have been 5 babies born with microcephaly in Guinea-Bissau, not due to any of the other known causes of microcephaly. Which means to me that you have to go back 7 or 8 months for when the Zika infection probably occurred. So it was probably already in Guinea-Bissau last fall, a year ago. Which to me means it's already quite probably in Guinea or Sierra Leone or Liberia or Cote d'Ivoire or other places. So it's not going to be an epidemic, or what I like to use the term pan-epidemic, because some people debate what is a pandemic and when is a pandemic not a pandemic. And Dr. Fauci, the paper I think said January 13th, that Wednesday, New England Journal of Medicine, it's a pandemic. I agree. Some people would say, well, it's not really in enough continents. So I call it a pan-epidemic. And regardless of what you call it, it's a very, very serious international global health problem, and it's going to get worse, including spread, in my opinion, unfortunately, in more parts of Africa.
Well, we've just finished with the Brazil Olympics, the Rio Olympics, and there was a lot of concern going into the Olympics that it was going to be an amplifying effect. And in fact, there were a number of high-profile scholars that lobbied the WHO and the International Olympic Committee to to cancel or postpone the Rio Olympics. I refused to sign that letter because I thought it was quite ill-advised. But now that the Olympics are over, did Brazil do a good job? I'll throw this out to anyone. Did they do a good job? Are we likely to see any amplification? And then I'd like to ask Tony about Singapore, because I did, a couple of months ago, I spent time with the dean of their medical school and the president of the university. They were really worried at that time because all the conditions with the Egypti mosquito were there, and they expressed concern. So anyone want to discuss whether Brazil did enough, whether WHO helped Brazil do enough, and what those possible effects were, and then secondly, where we're likely to see this next on the globe.
Well, it's always dangerous to comment about whether somebody did enough or not. I mean, what does enough mean? But two things were very much in their favor, and that's the thing that we spoke about, why I countered the opinion of the person who wrote that article and said they should cancel the Olympics, because first of all, it was, as you might expect, peaking in January and February, which is the summertime in Brazil. August is the middle of winter in Brazil. So the mosquitoes don't disappear, but they go down dramatically in their density. So what Brazil had in their favor were two things. One, there were much less mosquito. I'm sure they did a pretty good job of controlling the mosquitoes, but mosquitoes naturally are going to be much less at that time of year, and the less mosquitoes, the less infections, and just the way accelerated infection propagates itself, decelerating infection also diminishes itself. So by the time we got to August and July in Brazil, the conditions for a major outbreak were not there. So that was fortunate for the conduct of the Olympics. But I think the point that Dan made is a very good point about where is it going right now, because it's certainly not going to disappear. And I'm watching Singapore very, very carefully, because if you look at the numbers in Singapore, it went from a handful to like 50 to 80, and now there's well over 100 cases. That's different than what we're seeing in Florida, where the aggressive mosquito control is not eliminating it's controlling it.
Very highly populated region.
I mean, I think we need to really keep our eye out on Singapore, among other places.
Yeah. Let me just conclude, and then we'll take our break, about going back to the political part of this. I think both Steve and Tony talked, I think, quite wisely about the importance of a public health emergency contingency fund in the United States, so that when the next outbreak arises, and as Tony says, there will be a next and another and another and another, that we don't have to keep going to the political well to get more money, that we're prepared. And after all, the United States is one of the countries that pushed WHO to form a contingency fund. What are the prospects with this Congress or the next for that to happen? How optimistic are we?
I think we can be reasonably optimistic that the next administration, if it happens to be Hillary Clinton, will be committed to working that. She made the proposal a week ago, Monday, along those lines. It depends, I think, on how much continued threat we're seeing in the, how much noise and threat there is in the environment. But it requires a sort of determined push to get this done. And I think that certainly in circles like Hillary Clinton's, they've weighed this option and concluded that this is something that deserves to be a priority. And I think that's a signal of this set of experiences that we've just gone through, and how frustrating, exasperating, and embarrassing it is to the United States to be in that position when we should be leading in a much more robust and well-financed and more predictable way.
Yeah, I mean, the United States leadership in public health is well understood around the world. Not only are we supposedly very well prepared for public health emergencies, but we also contribute internationally. And when the world watches what happened with Ebola and now with the congressional inaction in Zika, the U.S.'s reputation is at stake. And now, of course, there are proposals and actualities of moving money that we promised for Ebola to Zika. So I think there are very, very strong grounds for hoping that Congress will take a bipartisan position and enact such a public health emergency contingency fund. With that, I want to thank the panel. We'll take about a 10-minute break. We'll come back, we'll reassemble the panel, and then I'm going to be calling on the audience, and particularly those who have responsibility in this area. I would really like to hear from you. Okay, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I think they're all getting their coffees. All right, I think we're going to start this next phase of the colloquium. We finished our panel discussion by talking about United States preparedness, but also the United States' role in mobilizing an international response to public health outbreaks and public health emergencies of concern, as we did very effectively with Ebola. It took a long time, but once to me, the lesson of Ebola is that we were woefully unprepared, but that when we actually did engage, we did a remarkable job. So it tells me controlling infectious diseases is something that we actually can do if we've got sufficient political will and resources, as many of the Ebola commissions have said. So I want to first call on the first questioner, Gianluca Berci. Gianluca is just stepped down as the head of the legal counsel's office at the World Health Organization and has a lot of experience in terms of not only the global response, but also the United States' role within that.
Thank you, Larry, and excellent panel. Thank you very much. Yes, following up on that, just the interface between the national and the international in a way. I was wondering, I heard you speak, if what happens internationally, particularly in WHO, declaration of fake, the emergency committee that kept elaborating on the recommended response, does this have an effect on the policy of the United States? It's a receptivity, in a way, by the federal government on what comes from WHO. And conversely, do you think that the apparent flaws, if you want, in the U.S. response and preparedness reflect on the image of the U.S. as an international leader, in particular its influence on WHO, on the larger public health community? In a way, if I look back at Ebola from inside WHO, I didn't see this. In a way, the leadership of the U.S. was not, in my view, my perception, affected by what may have been missing or the things that didn't work internally. But that was a bit of an anecdotal perception, and it would be interesting to see how you see this interface.
I'd say one of the two of you might answer that question.
Well, it is always very helpful when the WHO plays what we would hope would be its proactive role in addressing situations, be it a pandemic influenza or an Ebola outbreak. It's helpful to the world, but it's also helpful to what the United States would like to do. But I think you called it quite correctly. We do not wait for the WHO to make a move. It isn't as if we don't have respect for what the WHO does, but we have what we feel is a responsibility not only to the United States citizens, but actually to the world. We do have a global look at things, not only because it's enlightened self-interest, because what happens in the world can affect us, but also because we feel a moral responsibility as a rich country to be able to address these things. So in answer to your question, it's great to have the WHO actively involved, but we do not slow down. And I think Ebola was a classic example. We jumped all over Ebola before WHO, was involved. Right.
Steve?
I think it's, Gianluca, I think it's important to remind everybody here that when the emergency committee was pulled together and made its declaration February 1st, that was following a lot of debate in which the U.S. was very much at the center of the debate about strengthening the activity and the capacities of that emergency committee, being quicker off the mark, being more assertive, more authoritative in taking a position. And so that declaration was a reflection of U.S. policy. It was not done in isolation of U.S. policy. It was a reflection of the kind of very active work that Ambassador Kolker and others had been undertaking through the executive board and elsewhere. President Obama's request to Congress was, I believe, February 8th, the $1.9 billion. And I don't think that's a coincidence that there was a declaration February 1st and a request that went forward just a few days later. I think that declaration validated and legitimized and endorsed the view that we needed to get ahead within our hemisphere, to get ahead of this, to protect our population as well as to contribute to other populations in this hemisphere.
And Zika really should be more than Ebola because it's right here in our neighborhood, whereas Ebola was in West Africa. So I think there is a particular responsibility. And of course, the Pan American Health Organization is right here in Washington. Ambassador Kolker, did you want to jump in here?
Sure, I'm Jimmy Kolker, I'm Department of Health and Human Services, sorry. And we are the office that's the lead for the U.S. government in WHO governance. So we very much have been involved in these debates. And I think we concluded during the Ebola outbreak, in which I think all of us were a little bit slow, WHO in particular failed to be the organization we needed to lead a global health response, but there really was no replacement, and there have been 5 blue ribbon panels following up on Ebola. What did we do right and wrong? All of them came to essentially the same conclusion, that WHO didn't do a good job, but there really was not an alternative to strengthening their emergency and outbreak response. And especially because it's a global health law class, international health regulations are unique. There is a binding international agreement which countries have to take certain measures, including about restricting or not restricting travel, which were not necessarily followed in the case of Ebola. But the international health regulations do form a basis for international cooperation, and we've moved from self-reporting of compliance to now joint external evaluations using a U.S.-led global health security agenda instrument. But it couldn't happen without multilateralizing this so that WHO brands this and is able to make it something that's recommended for all countries in the world. So I think there's a real synergy here. The muscle and a lot of the initiative and drawing attention to problems come from U.S. surveillance that we're especially good at. But there's no question that WHO continues to be an essential partner, and it's in our interest that their reforms result in a quicker, more responsive, and more comprehensive reaction to outbreaks and emergencies.
Well, thanks. And I wanted to ask you, Jimmy, and Gianluca, and Dan, a little bit more about WHO, because they have gone through a very rocky period. They did start a new global health emergency program, but it's not very well funded. But they're also undergoing an election process for a new director general. So what should be the priority of the new director general? How could she or he transform the organization so it was more proactive that it was able to mobilize political will and financing better than it has been in the past. Either of the three of you. Did you want to jump in,
I'll
Dan?
just comment briefly, but really it's more, I think, a question for you. But I just want to emphasize for the students, as you probably know, that under the international health regulations updated in 2005, in my opinion, immense authority and responsibility is invested in one person, the Director General of the World Health Organization. So only she, and this is Dr. Chan's 10th and final year, but it will be someone else next year, that only the Director General can convene the emergency committee that then advises her as to whether or not an event constitutes a public health emergency of international concern. And secondly, only she can decide whether to declare a public health emergency of international concern. In other words, to take the advice or not take the advice of the emergency committee. So in my view, from the experience, the very searing experience, unforgettable experience working with more than 200 patients with Ebola 24 months ago in Sierra Leone, and subsequently with Doctors Without Borders, MSF in Liberia, in October, November 2014, and then subsequent work and publications that Larry and I have made this year with regard to WHO convening the emergency committee for Zika, and then for yellow fever, and then reconvening it today. I think that the authority and responsibility of the Director General to convene the emergency committee, I think it's more important, and I think it's much less appreciated than her authority and responsibility for declaring a public health emergency of international concern or not. Because if you don't convene the committee, no possibility of declaring a public health emergency of international concern. And I think that there's significant international impact in a very positive manner to convening the emergency committee itself. So emergency committees have been convened for MERS 10 times without a public health emergency of international concern ever being declared. They've been convened now for yellow fever on May 19th without a public health emergency of international concern being declared. We'll see what's decided today. But I think it's immensely important and underappreciated that only one person, the Director General, can convene the emergency committee. It's very, very important under the international health regulations. So, I'm sorry, Jean-Luc.
Yeah, I agree. In a way, it's a striking delegation of authority by the international community to an international secretariat. At the same time, it shouldn't be seen like almost like an arbitrary power, the Director General, that the declaration of a fake, and as you said, even convening the emergency committee for its symbolism is a deeply political act. So there are consultations going on, there are checks and balances, there's more than meets the eye. Obviously, WHO can get it wrong, did get it wrong. I think it's part of the professional risks, but I think there's a clear feeling that the emergency committee and all the mechanisms surrounding the IHR are part of a political package. And a sense of checks and balances of what WHO can do in exercising its functions. But to react quickly to Larry's question, I think at this point the creation of an emergency response capacity in WHO is an irreversible reality. It's been set up a bit painfully, and we'll see whether it stands the test of time. There are 2 points there, 3 points. The first is financing, as you said, because for me it's fundamentally hypocritical. The member states put a lot of pressure on WHO to make really painful reform that don't really fit with what WHO has seen until now as its traditional constitutional mandate, which is not as a fire brigade. But at the same time, denying the financing or simply giving a budget space, but then asking the Director General to go again hand in hand to collect money from donors without having a solid, ready financial package for early response. So financing is the first. The second is political commitment, because it only in that case, I think, this capacity of WHO will be sustainable and not just a very short-term sort of stopgap exercise. And the third is actual cooperation, because WHO is especially in terms of human resources, is very small player. If you're talking about big deployment, Ebola style or Haiti style, WHO will rely on external partners. The United States will play definitely a leading role in that. So these to me are the three elements that will determine the success or the failure of a reform that, once again, is really being painful because it's like creating an organization within an organization with the operational autonomy, with a level of accountability and like mechanism of oversight that were not exactly part of the fabric of WHO. So I don't think that the next DG will have the possibility of reversing this. In a way, we'll have the possibility of strengthening this. Strengthening this first, and second, strengthening the international health regulations. As you know, the report of the EU committee was welcomed, but it also got mixed reception in the Health Assembly. It didn't get a total clean bill of health. The Director General has to come back next year, so that we did the next Director General almost, with a strategic plan for implementing these recommendations. And so I think the jury is still out whether there will be the political will to support a number of reforms that I think are essential to give more credibility to the IHR. So I would say these are the two prongs. Reforming the IHR as a legal framework which by now is generally accepted as fundamentally valid but in need of strengthening, and second, supporting the operational capacity of WHO.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Hi,
Introduce yourself. Yeah. Oh, you are. Good.
Hi, my name is Sultan Bali. I did my research at Duke looking at the impact of Ebola in Nigeria. So my question is, obviously vaccine is key, and as Anthony Fauci mentioned in his presentation, there was a really big outbreak of chikungunya in Caribbean before Ebola hit. Also, Southeast Asia saw a massive epidemic of dengue and chikungunya in 2013 as well. And now we're talking about Zika, and most recently they've also found that Zika is present in culex. So my question is, there is a lot of course, effort going on for vaccines. Why are we not seeing more work for integrated vector management? Not only in, even, for example, yellow fever in DRC, where, Dan Lucy talked about that very briefly. Countries like China, India are, very vulnerable to it. So do you see in future more trend towards vector management, more funding and financing going towards that in future to control arboviruses?
The answer is yes, but I'm not so sure it's going to be successful. Vector management is proven to be extremely problematic. Probably the best example of vector management that was successful is something that would be unacceptable in today's society was in Brazil in the 50s when they essentially got rid of Aedes aegypti. And they did it by means that would not be acceptable, a combination of very aggressive use of DDT and almost a militaristic going into people's homes and places of work to clean up standing water. Yeah. We know from what's going on in Puerto Rico, what has gone on in Brazil now, and even what's gone on in Florida, how difficult it is when you have a climate that is a semi-tropical, moist climate to get rid of the breeding places of mosquitoes is extremely problematic, particularly when you're dealing with Aedes aegypti. You almost have to spray essentially every day because they cycle with the hatching of the eggs into larvae, and you could put a very aggressive effort that's very expensive today, and then on Friday or Saturday, they're back almost to the same level. So it is something that you need to address, but I don't see it as being something that's easily attainable, and that's the reason why you're hearing a lot of discussion about genetically modified mosquitoes, about Wolbachia-infected mosquitoes, all things that I think have promise, but we've got to be very careful because there's an equally as concerned group about the impact on the environment. Bottom line is it's not easy, right?
Yeah, and so if vector control isn't easy, one of the things that does seem intuitively obvious, certainly to the American public, is the importance of vaccines, diagnostics, and treatment. And what we've noticed, we notice it with yellow fever, we notice it with Zika, we notice it with Ebola and many others, is that when an epidemic hits, we don't seem to have models, really good pathways to vaccines and others. It's taking a while. And there are market incentives against that because it's an episodic phenomenon. Industry is not likely to invest in it because it is so episodic. So several of the Ebola commissions talked about new research and development priorities and different kinds of funding streams that might, with private partner, public partnerships and the like, to try to incentivize early research on pathogens that are circulating but have not yet hit.
Yeah, I turned that around, Larry. I don't think we need to incentivize early research. We need to incentivize advanced development of vaccines. The platform that we're using, one of the several platforms we're using for Zika is a DNA platform which was developed for a vaccine against West Nile. So the Vaccine Research Center at NIH, which is doing the Zika DNA vaccine, developed a very nice vaccine against West Nile. It was very good in preclinical studies. We did a phase 1 study. It was safe, and it induced a really good immune response. We could not find a company to partner with to advance development. The same thing with chikungunya. We have a really good candidate that we're in phase 2 trials now in the Caribbean, and only now that we're starting to get companies interested in helping to develop a vaccine for chikungunya. Because of the publicity, understandable, that we're getting with Zika now, we have several companies that are interested in going the distance with us. So it really is the incentive to develop a vaccine that might not necessarily have universal usage. And that gets back to our willingness to make investments in developing vaccines for things that are not going to be a hot item for people to use. And there's a lot of effort that's going in to try and develop that kind of an approach that will have it.
Good. I have other follow-up questions to that, but why don't I get some other people in the room to ask? Anna?
Hi, my name is Anna Ayala. I'm the director of the Global Health Law LLM program at the O'Neill Institute. And I had a question primarily for Dr. Fauci in terms of whether you could elaborate a little more of the ethical issues that goes into clinical trials in the case of Zika, considering that women, pregnant women, are the population that is most at risk at the moment.
Well, yeah, I'm not so sure if you'd call it an ethical issue, but it's an issue that you have to take into consideration. The ultimate target of a Zika vaccine is not a pregnant woman, it's a woman of childbearing age. Because if you have a pregnant woman who's infected, before she even knows she's infected, it might even be too late. So the target would be very similar to the target of a rubella vaccine. There's a great deal of similarity. Rubella is a relatively mild disease. It has a self-limiting infection, and it doesn't cause anybody any harm except if a woman gets infected during pregnancy, and then you get the rubella syndrome. So if you want to call that an issue, we have to be aware ethically of the issue of danger to pregnant women. The issue of the kind of clinical trial you do is also maybe have an ethical flavor to it, in that when you're dealing with flaviviruses, particularly with dengue, there's the potential, theoretically, of antibody-related enhancement. In other words, if you have a vaccine that is suboptimal in its efficacy, and you get infected with the microbe in question, you might actually have enhancement rather than protection. We've seen that when you've infected with one serotype of dengue versus another, which tells us that you have to be very careful in the design of your clinical trial. And we had considerable discussion about this during the Ebola outbreak. There is always a knee-jerk reaction when you have an outbreak there and you have an intervention. Just go out and give it to people because you have a moral imperative to do that, as opposed to saying you really need to know A, if it works, and B, if it's safe, and probably not in that order. A, if it's safe, and B, if it works. And in order to do that, you have to design a clinical trial to get the answer as quickly as you can without putting people at risk. Because when you're dealing with a vaccine, unlike a drug, Vaccine is given to a normal person to protect them, as opposed to someone with an advanced disease who needs a drug, where the risk-benefit ratio is much, much different when you're dealing with a sick person who needs an intervention versus a completely well person who needs prevention. So in my mind, those are the ethical issues that come into vaccine development.
Hi, I'm Claire Stanley, Department of International Health, Georgetown University. I actually just wanted to follow up on that point and ask a bit about co-infections, and if you could speak a little bit to the idea that perhaps previous infection with dengue or maybe even chikungunya may be impacting some of the epidemiological patterns that we're seeing, particularly in Latin America.
So the question you're asking relates to the directly or indirectly to what I said about antibody-mediated enhancement. So the question is, if you've been exposed to one flavivirus, and remember the flaviviruses are dengue, they're Zika, they're West Nile, they're yellow fever, Japanese encephalitis, those are all flaviviruses. So theoretically, since there is this issue in vitro for sure, and with dengue but no other demonstrated infection, the possibility of antibody-mediated enhancement, even though there's been no in vivo demonstration that that's really the case, that if you were infected with West Nile or you got vaccinated with yellow fever, that you have a low level of a cross-reactive flavivirus antibody, that if you then get infected, you might actually have a more serious. The answer is that's theoretically possible, getting back to what I just mentioned to you about the importance when you do a vaccine trial, make sure you have the right controls, because you might see that. But if you look historically about people, and again, you got to be careful about studies in which you prospectively ask the question versus retrospective observational studies. They have weaknesses inherently, but given their weaknesses, retrospective observational studies say that people who've been previously vaccinated with yellow fever or have had West Nile virus don't seem to have any more difficult courses with other flaviviruses. So I can say that with a big caveat. It was done retrospectively and not prospectively.
Sure, back there.
Hi, Andrew Schweitzer, Georgetown law student. So I'm curious, in line with that question, what role do you foresee the Precision Health Initiative having to do in this case? Will there be like longitudinal data analysis to try to corroborate your hypothesis that the likelihood of having worse reactions given the vaccinations is has a greater unlikelihood? Recently there's been a lot of funding put forth towards this big kind of data analysis of individuals, and for the Precision Health Initiative going forward, do you see its role expanding into this area of global health issues and infections? So
potentially it could, but right now the Precision Medicine Initiative, the PMI, is not geared towards any particular disease or population. They're just gaining a cohort of 1 million people to see what to do with it. But in direct answer to your question, it is certainly conceivable that you can do that. And the best way to get the answer to what you're saying is to have a 10,000 person randomized controlled trial, because you could find out exactly the answer if you do a randomized controlled trial. The power of a randomized controlled trial should never be underestimated. Sometimes you have to be more flexible and do a different kind of a trial, but in general, that's sort of the gold standard of answering the question that you're asking.
I want to bring Steve and Dan into this conversation, and particularly going back to the political situation, because Tim Westmoreland, who worked for Congressman Waxman for many years, talked to me during the break, and I'll invite Tim to comment on this as well, about the fact that there actually has been established a public health emergency fund that hasn't been funded, and some of the students have said, well, wouldn't this be a slush fund? What would trigger it? So maybe why don't I either invite Tim or Steve to reflect on those two issues, to kind of bring us full circle back to the importance of Congress proactively funding these kinds of problems.
Well, we have other precedents outside of pandemic emergencies in which you've had set aside funds for priority purposes, and you can pretty well lay out what the trigger conditions are and what the reporting requirements are, so that there's a measure of accountability and transparency in how that money is used, and it can be it's there to satisfy, in this case, some clear requirements that we're seeing over and over again. So I don't believe that if you can get over the first hump and get Congress thinking long term about having regularly budgeted funds available for this purpose, not just authorizing something but not funding it, which is I think what Tim's going to tell us about, then I think you can begin to acquire a record of performance, and a record of performance will only, I think, begin to legitimize yourself. The most important thing is that this have credibility on a bipartisan basis, that it be seen as, that you can demonstrate that those dollars are being put to critically important use with concrete outcomes in very important cases. And I think we've seen here, if we are paying a huge price by not having that, and I think that has to be brought forward. We have 6 vaccine candidates. We are months behind in being able to fully move those forward. If we had had a contingency fund available in February, Tony, where would we be today? Would we be closer to, if we believe the vaccine is the penultimate solution for something like Zika, and we know it's going to take approximately X number of years or months in order to get us to that point, a 6-month delay is a terribly costly delay in the midst of this. And you can calculate the number of likely microcephalic or brain-damaged infants that are going to be born in that period when you do not have a vaccine. You can begin to demonstrate the cost of not having it, as well as putting in place those sort of reporting requirements that would demonstrate to a skeptic that this is being put to worthy cause.
So we've got the costs, the potential costs and delay, but also, Tim, you're very thoughtful about the budgetary process. Are there problems about projecting funding going forward? And how do we explain the existence of a fund that hasn't been properly funded? What are the pathways to making this work?
Well, the Public Health Emergency Trust Fund is in the Public Health Service Act, was originally enacted in 1983 in the very early days of the AIDS epidemic, when we thought or prayed that it was going to be a passing problem, an ephemeral issue. And it's mostly been unappropriated.
Right.
You're exactly right that it's authorized and not appropriated. It's 4 issues that arise during the course of a budget year when it's a structural problem that the Congress and the administration, but again, they're budgeting 2 years in advance. And so lots of times things arise during the course of a budget year that haven't been planned for. But I have to say, having been authorized, most of the time neither Democratic nor Republican administrations request appropriations for it. They just don't. And having been authorized, most of the time Democratic or Republican majorities in the Congress don't put the money aside either. I think there are some budget complications to doing so, but I think most of the time it's the structural or political will issue of why put aside money for an unknown need that might be useful in the future when you've got all these current needs that we're competing for limited funds for now.
All right, I got to break in. I have to add this to this presentation here. So the date here, they're talking about August 2000. They're talking in August of 2016. Okay, August of 2016. Let's look at the charts here. I just can't stop hammering this home. The rates of microcephaly. Okay, if you look at these charts here, okay, in 2016, in August, we're already back at normal levels. The rates of microcephaly in South America were already back at historic levels. They were at historical levels in July. They were almost there in June. Still elevated in May. But they were already back. The threat was already gone. It was already over. And we still have not conclusively proven that this microcephaly and the total number of cases, which have actually since been revised down because much of it, the increases were, even as it was happening, estimated. So it's been revised down. Total additional microcephaly cases between 1,000 to 500 to maybe 3,000 to 3,500 in reality. North and South America, total. And it had already returned down. So this meeting, everything should be preceded with a statement of, we still don't know what caused it, and it was no longer a risk. We don't know what caused it. It could have been Zika. That's a fair statement because it's not conclusively been shown to be anything else. But we still don't know exactly what caused it. It could have been 1,000 other things. All right? And it's already over. And they are talking about it like it's getting worse. This is a magnificent, monstrous crime that's happening right now. This fear that they are driving. And even back, if you go back to the charts of August, I should say May. Actually, even before then, okay, you will find reports coming out April and May showing that the rates of microcephaly, give me a second here, I'm going to pull up the chart, we're already going back down. They are already starting to go down. Matter of fact, they were going down in the last week. In the last week of 2015, they were already on a path down. Did one person state in this hour and 45-minute presentation that not only were they at historic levels then, but they had been going down all the way since the 47th week of 2015? The answer is no. Not one person says that. They just elude that it's still increasing. And they're using this to say they need more money. They're using it to say that anyone that doesn't agree with their agenda is anti-science. They're using it to say that women all over are going to be at risk. Fauci says one of the most disgusting things I think I've ever heard him say. The target isn't pregnant women. The target is women of childbearing age, which is another way of Fauci really saying the target, if the baby's already conceived, it's already too late. What Fauci and others are really saying is they want the vaccines, the gene therapy, targeted at a woman just before she's about to conceive a child. That is the target. I've been too. I've actually haven't been harsh enough saying, limiting myself to saying it was pregnant women. I thought that was a horrible thing to say, but no, it's all women of childbearing age. That's wow. Anyways, this has to be just hammered home. I really wanted that captured in the video. Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to showcase. I can't remember exactly what it is at this time. Also, I guess this would be a good place to mention it. The DNA vaccine that is being considered is from Inovio. And Inovio also just happened to be the very first company to have a vaccine available for SARS-CoV-2. You can go through those articles. They have a DNA vaccine, which is actually administered through an electro something or other device on the skin. It's not using a needle. It's different. Now, the other company, which isn't really talked about too much, is Moderna. And Moderna is working on an mRNA vaccine for Zika. Also interesting is that Moderna actually created a little side company in early 2015 called Valera LLC, with the vice president Stéphane Bancel, same guy who's the CEO right now, and their chief scientific director would have been Giuseppe Ciaramella, who went on to be the scientific director at Moderna. All right. Now, the Vaccine Research Center, created in the late 1990s by Anthony Fauci. The Vaccine Research Center then is so important. On November 5th and 9th, the Vaccine Research Center signed a confidential disclosure agreement between the NIAID, the Vaccine Research Institute, the Vaccine Research Center, and Moderna, with Giuseppe Ciaramella and Stéphane Bancel of Moderna being the people receiving the technology, and the person signing over that technology was Dr. Barney Graham. Moderna then went on to have this cooperative research and development agreement modified just a few days before the election in 2016. And the modification at election said that it went from being a cooperative knowledge sharing agreement for a generic mRNA vaccine. Moderna's proprietary and confidential information is related to the design and manufacture of a messenger mRNA platform and messenger RNA constructs for treatment and prevention of disease, to include Zika. Since then, it's noteworthy that Barney Graham has moved on and works as a consultant for Moderna. Also noteworthy is that Barney Graham's longtime friend, college roommate, if you will, William Gruber, is now the vice president of Pfizer and is part of many of the CDC and FDA meetings on the safety and efficacy of Pfizer's mRNA medicine, first treating COVID-19. So you got Graham and Gruber, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, basically bookending both sides. Also, Graham went to Vanderbilt, should be noteworthy, and Gruber also went to spend time at Vanderbilt. And Vanderbilt is also where the founder of CEPI, the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness, went, as well as a whole bunch of other interesting characters in our story here. I'm going to put out the possibility that whatever Moderna was working on, and Moderna was building a factory at this time, I wouldn't even be surprised if Moderna's vaccine for Zika is identical to what's being used right now for coronavirus. Another person also mentioned Bill Gates in some of these in the comments earlier. I forget what the context of that was. Oh yes, regarding these microcephaly cases, the connection of microcephaly to Zika, which is still not proven. I want it noted that the person whose research is most cited as making a connection of a mosquito vectored virus to microcephaly is Dr. Thomas Hill Shepard. Now, Shepard passed at the end of 2016. He was well into his 80s, so old age. But Thomas Hill Shepard created the world's largest fetal cell tissue and birth defect reference laboratory, and it was at the University of Washington, and it was under the control, hence being at the University of Washington, where some of the most important people with respect to being regents and working with the government of the state of Washington is Bill Gates Sr. and, of course, Mary Maxwell Gates, Bill Gates' mom. And that laboratory was created in 1962 and has a high level of correlation with the Special Virus Cancer Program. He's also worked with Robert Nowinski, and I wouldn't even be surprised if some of the increased support for legalized abortion going back to Roe v. Wade was in part driven by the need to increase the ability to legally procure cell lines. It's not because there weren't enough abortions already. It's just that they needed more legal abortions. And that is your Gates connection. Before Gates was even able to, Bill Gates even able to ride a bicycle. This is Bill Gates Sr., University of Washington, genetics, fetal cells, cancer, Fred Hutch Institute, bone marrow transplants, computing, Boeing, future security of the United States of America. Think Thomas Rona, think Lederberg. That said, let's just play the rest of this video. Only like 10 minutes left.
And most of the time, both executive branch and legislative branch people say, I've got so many problems I have to deal with now, I can't put something aside. And I think that I don't think it's necessarily related, I don't think it's in any way related to public health. I mean, we don't have an adequate hurricane repair trust fund either, and we don't have an adequate highway repair trust fund. We just don't save money for things that we can't immediately say we're going to spend for. And I hope that what you guys are saying, that the consciousness is arising because of Ebola and Zika, that there will be things that arise during the course of a budget year, or even 18 months after the budget year, that people really do need to have money to the side for so that they can take immediate action for something as much of an emergency as what you're describing today. I don't disagree with you about how the authorization could be put together and triggered and those kinds of things. I don't think there's any reason to think it need be unsuccessful. I just think the Congress and the administration always want to spend the money for their currently identified needs.
But I mean, you have an argument made by high levels of the White House and the executive branch that this is not an episodic and very unoccasional demand, but this is becoming something that is recurrent and dangerous and touches national interests. And has risen, that this pandemic preparedness issue has risen from being a sort of secondary or third order priority to something that is now recognized as a higher priority. I think you've got an argument around that gets over the why would we put money into something that we may not use.
I pray that you are correct. There are obviously some budget games to be played. I mean, we've known that we needed hurricane repair for a lot longer than we've known we needed pandemic preparedness, but we don't budget for that either. We wait for emergency no-year money, and then Republicans and Democrats can debate on whether it has to be offset with other cuts or not. You may remember that this is the reason Chris Christie actually hugged Barack Obama, was that he came out in favor of no offsets, and Chris Christie wanted that to happen. I mean, it just seems to me that there's a political dead weight out there when you can't immediately identify where the money is going for. But I pray that you're correct, that senior people and senior legislators can be conscious that Zika and Ebola and whatever, as Tony says, the next problem will be. But it's not simply the politicians. I mean, there have been years in which the public health people have said, oh no, we need the money for this also, and haven't asked for it to be budgeted for an unknown contingency in the future too. So.
Okay, we have one more question, and then I'm going to invite the panelists to say some closing words, and we'll wrap up. Okay, already asked the question, so why don't I move toward the summary. Dan, you haven't had a lot of opportunity to speak. Why don't you reflect now, not just on Zika, but the lessons learned from Ebola, Zika going forward, and what you hope and expect will happen with the current emergency committee on yellow fever, including, I think, the problem of getting better technologies for vaccines to avoid future scarcities.
All in 30 seconds.
All in 30
Let me
seconds.
go here. So to start with the last one, yellow fever. I think we need a lot more yellow fever vaccine. I think that's been proven by the fact that August 17th to 27th, under the WHO's leadership, an astounding, wonderful thing happened, which was, in my opinion, over 8 million people were vaccinated in Kinshasa, the capital of DR Congo. But they had to use 1/5, 20% of the normal dose of vaccine because we didn't have enough right at this time to give a full dose. A full dose will protect for a lifetime of yellow fever vaccine. A 5th dose, 12 months, 1 year, probably longer, but we don't know how much longer, et cetera. So in terms of more technology or different technologies, in July, I believe, Tony and NIAID announced that they're starting to test, or going to test, I think, in 90 people, a phase 1 study of a new type of a yellow fever vaccine, a MVA vectored vaccine. So that's one example. Another, in my opinion, is to make cell culture derived yellow fever vaccine. We've made because then you can make very large amounts of it. And it's a technology that we know, that the world knows, that the Food and Drug Administration knows and has approved other vaccines for. That's what we need, because if yellow fever goes to Asia for the first time, it never ever has. 11 travelers, Chinese nationals from Angola, went home with yellow fever in March and April. Mosquitoes aren't biting, so we're worried about Aedes biting and spreading Zika. In China, they're worried about Aedes biting and spreading yellow fever. They weren't biting and spreading yellow fever in March and April, but now they are biting. So if there was an epidemic of yellow fever in Asia or in some other parts of the world, there's not enough vaccine. And you can't make enough because the technology for an emergency, in my opinion, because the technology uses eggs, special pathogen-free eggs, just like a lot of the old influenza vaccine technology. But maybe 10 years ago, the United States began, at least one center, I believe in one of the Carolinas, we now have a cell culture-derived influenza vaccine plant. Which I think the U.S. government was involved in, and probably Tony, in helping to make that happen. So that's what I'd say as far as yellow fever right now. The only other comment I'd like to make to try to sum up everything else that you offered me the opportunity to speak about, and in closing, is that I think that it's not just a matter of what's next, which is what I've always asked, and Tony and many other people, because what's next is already out there. It's already here. Ebola began in Guinea in the Forster region, we think, in December of 2013, but we didn't know it till March 23rd of 2014 when it was lab confirmed in Lyon, France. Zika came to Brazil in December of 2014, but we didn't know about it. It was an itchy rash, 7,000 people. We didn't know what it was until May of 2015. December of 2015, so 3 Decembers in a row, I'm giving these examples, Angola appeared in Luanda, the capital of Angola, but it wasn't recognized. And so we've been behind with vaccinating Angola. 4 separate times, requests for vaccine against yellow fever had to be put forward from the government of Angola. And now the majority of people, close to 80%, are vaccinated in Angola. The epidemic, I think, is almost stopped, almost. So it's already out there. That's one thing. And the last thing I'd like to say is, in my view, we've entered into what I would like to call the epidemic Anthropocene. The Anthropocene meaning the age of humans. So 2 days ago in Cape Town, South Africa, the annual international meeting of the Geologic Congress, a subset of them called the Working Group on the Anthropocene, trying to decide on, have we entered into a new geologic and planetary stage? So it's thought that we live in the Holocene, and before that the Pleistocene, and before, and I don't know all the befores, what they're called, but it goes back, before the dinosaurs, right? So 2 days ago they said that yes, they think that we are in the Anthropocene, and others have said that, but they put a specific date on it. which is between 1945 and 64, which we all know it's approximately 1950, so it's the beginning of the atomic age. So that aside, in my view, we can talk about the Anthropocene with the capital A, but we can also talk about with the small a, which some scientists did in March 2015 in Nature last year. And they proposed there could be an industrial Anthropocene, an agricultural Anthropocene. It started at different times. I'd say there's an epidemic Anthropocene, and we're well into it. And it may go back at least as far as when the Europeans came to this continent, and many, 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 many millions of people died. Something called the orb spike, ORB, Latin for world. But I think that forces anthropogenic, what we are doing to our world, so globalization, plane travel, lots of other kind of travel, but rapid plane travel anywhere around the world, urbanization. So we've had
climate change.
Climate change, for sure. Many of these forces that are primarily anthropogenic also make the risk of epidemics, and again, I really emphasize the word pan-epidemics, to be much more likely. And I think it's the interaction of those two factors that is the epidemic Anthropocene that we're in now, and we're not going to ever leave it. And we need to step up to it from a political and financial and international responsibility and action point of view now.
So if it is true that we're in a world where epidemics could spread more rapidly, and even with the advent of vaccines, are we prepared, Steve, as a nation and internationally? And if not, what do we need to do?
Let me, first of all, thank you, Larry, for pulling us all together today. I really appreciate this. This has been very valuable. I don't think we're prepared. I think we're at a turning point. I think, as Tony's pointed out, we're at a moment where the decisions have to be taken. Otherwise, things are going to freeze up in our own response here when we're talking about Zika. We're vulnerable that vaccines won't happen. We're vulnerable that there's going to be spread into areas like Alabama or Louisiana where you could see clusters and not have very good preparations. There could be quiet spread. We've talked about that. That leaves us in the dark a bit about how and where. We face serious political problems on the Hill. Those may not it may not be possible to transcend those until after our election cycle, but we have to try really hard in the coming weeks to try and get past those. We are seeing it's a very fluid situation globally with respect to Zika. I mean, the Southeast Asia, the Singapore events. Here at home, Puerto Rico remains such a fast-moving story. The screening of the national blood supply is going to give us a better picture of what's going on, and we're beginning to see the economic consequences in Florida in terms of travel, tourism, very important facts. My last thought is just to say I think we're very much in the debt of Tony, of Amy Pope, of Tom Frieden, of Ann Schuchat, of the Florida authorities, folks who've worked at a prodigious pace over the course of the last several months to put together a framework that has shown some very significant results under very adverse circumstances.
And we've been lucky because Florida, and particularly Miami, have highly functioning health departments. So if it happened in a place that didn't have any mosquito control authority or other or funding, it could have been much worse, and maybe it still will be. Tony, final words?
Okay, so very briefly, to just harken back to my last slide about the perpetual challenge of emerging and re-emerging infections, I just want to put a pitch to the audience, which is very much like preaching to the choir, because I believe everybody in this room probably feels the same way, is to never forget the importance of investments in research in global health. We do not live in a vacuum here, and there are moves among some in Congress to essentially apportion money based on DALYs within this country, namely disability-adjusted life years in this country, which means that if you look at that and say how much money should you spend per DALY or per death,
cancer, heart disease.
well, then you can forget about malaria research, you can forget about HIV research, you can forget about research for emerging and re-emerging infections. So I just want to put them to pitch loud and clear publicly here, and anyone who's listening, of why it's so important for us to have an investment in global health and not think in terms of provincialism for ourselves, because what affects the rest of the world will affect us, and what affects us is going to affect the rest of the world. It's very, very difficult, as Tim pointed out so well, to ask for something that hasn't happened yet when you have a lot of things that are already happening. We just need to get over that and beyond that and realize that you have to prepare for things that have not yet happened. Otherwise, you're going to be continually in the same hole that you find yourself in when you're chasing an outbreak. The worst thing to do is to try and chase an outbreak. The outbreak almost always wins. You have to be ahead of the outbreak.
So are we prepared in the United States? Are we prepared globally? I think you've heard the answer is not yet. So it just remains for me to take really, really great pleasure in giving my heartfelt thanks for the amazing contributions, not just in this room, but throughout their lifetime, of Steve Morrison, Tony Fauci, and Dan Lucy. I think you've heard from three of the most articulate and passionate voices in global health. So on behalf of Georgetown University and the O'Neill Institute, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you very much.
Thank you.